I want to be very precise about what just happened. This was not a random raid, and it was not simply about Nicolás Maduro. At its core, this was about power, how it is exercised, how it is perceived, and how it is changing. For years, China believed global influence could be built through patience, through loans instead of bombs, through ports, pipelines, and partnerships rather than soldiers. Venezuela was a textbook case. Oil for cash, infrastructure for loyalty, diplomatic cover in exchange for alignment. The United States, by contrast, sent a very different signal, that when its strategic interests are challenged, especially in what it still considers its sphere of influence, it is willing to bypass process and act decisively. This creates a dangerous ambiguity, because if power is no longer restrained by distance, diplomacy, or precedent, then every capital must ask the same question: who is truly protected, and who is merely tolerated? And to understand why this moment feels so destabilizing, we need to look at how China built its influence in Venezuela in the first place, and why it mattered so much. To understand that, we have to rewind. China did not arrive in Venezuela with troops or ultimatums. It arrived with capital. At a moment when Caracas was increasingly isolated from the West, Beijing stepped in as a lender of last resort, not out of charity, but strategy. Beginning in the late 2000s, China extended tens of billions of dollars in loans. In return, it secured long-term access to oil, infrastructure contracts, and political alignment. This was influence built slowly, deliberately, and quietly. For Venezuela's leaders, the appeal was obvious. Chinese money came with fewer lectures about governance, fewer conditions, and a shared suspicion of a US-led global order. For Beijing, Venezuela became something else entirely, a proof of concept that China could project power far from its borders without firing a single shot, that economic gravity could substitute for military force, that the future of geopolitics belonged to balance sheets, not battlefields. But history has a rhythm, and every system eventually reveals its limits, because what works in times of stability is often tested and exposed in moments of crisis. And that test arrived suddenly, violently, and without warning. The crisis did not announce itself with speeches or warnings. It arrived in the middle of the night. American special forces moved fast, quietly, precisely, and by morning, Nicolás Maduro, the man who had anchored China's influence in Venezuela for years, was gone. This was a shock, not because coups are new, but because of how it was done. No coalition, no prolonged conflict, no attempt to reshape Venezuela overnight. Just a single surgical act that removed the center of gravity. For Beijing, this was deeply unsettling, because China's model depends on continuity. Long-term partners, stable regimes, predictable elites, and in one operation, that entire architecture collapsed. If you've been following global politics closely, this is the moment you should pause, because it signals something larger. Great powers are no longer just competing through markets and institutions. They are increasingly willing to take direct action, fast, targeted, and deniable. If this feels like a turning point, that's because it is. And if you want to understand what this kind of power really looks like, and why it's so dangerous, stay with me. Because the most important part of this story is not what we saw. It's what was happening beneath the surface. What was happening beneath the surface was not chaos. It was structure. China's relationship with Venezuela was never about a single leader. It was about a system, loans tied to oil shipments, infrastructure projects embedded into daily life, telecommunications, power grids, transport, the invisible architecture of a modern state. This is how Beijing prefers to operate, not through dramatic interventions, but through entanglement. The deeper a country becomes woven into Chinese capital and technology, the harder it is to pull away without pain. Economic dependence becomes political leverage, and political leverage becomes strategic insurance. But that system has a vulnerability. It assumes time. It assumes predictability. It assumes that influence, once built, cannot be removed overnight. The US operation exposed that assumption. By targeting leadership rather than infrastructure, Washington avoided immediate economic collapse while still achieving maximum strategic disruption. China's assets remained. Its contracts stood, but its guarantees vanished. This is the uncomfortable truth for Beijing. Economic power is expansive, but it is slow. Military power is risky, but it is fast. And in moments of acute crisis, speed often outweighs scale. That realization is now forcing a recalibration, not just in Caracas, but in Beijing itself. And the consequences of that recalibration are already beginning to surface. The second shock did not come from Washington. It came from inside. As news of the raid spread, Chinese social media exploded. Hundreds of millions of views. A single question, repeated again and again. If the United States can do this in its backyard, why can't China? For some, the answer seemed obvious. Venezuela became a case study, a rehearsal, a blueprint. If a leader can be removed without invasion, without occupation, without months of war, then power suddenly looks smaller, sharper, more usable. This is where the danger lies. Because while officials in Beijing condemned the raid as hegemonic bullying, the online reaction revealed something else entirely. A growing appetite for decisive force. A belief that restraint is weakness, that sovereignty is only real if it can be enforced at speed. Yet here is the paradox. What looks easy on a screen rarely is in reality. Taiwan is not Venezuela. Its defenses are deeper. Its alliance is stronger. Its legitimacy more entrenched. And Beijing knows this, which is why this moment matters so much. Not because it changes China's plans overnight, but because it shifts the psychological boundary of what seems possible. And once that boundary moves, it rarely moves back. Now let me speak directly to you, because moments like this are often discussed in abstract terms. Power, strategy, great powers. But their consequences are deeply personal. If you are watching this from Taiwan, from East Asia, or from any country caught between giants, this moment lands differently. It creates unease, a quiet recalculation. You begin to wonder how fragile stability really is, how much of your safety depends not on laws or norms, but on decisions made far away, in rooms you will never enter. When leaders can be removed overnight, deterrence stops being theoretical. It becomes psychological. You start asking harder questions. Is our defense enough? Are our alliances real? Would anyone act quickly if the moment came? This is why events like Venezuela ripple outward. They don't just alter maps, they alter minds. If this analysis resonates with you, share it. Because understanding power is the first step toward surviving it. And as this psychological shock spreads, it does not stop at national borders. It travels across oceans. Because what happens between Washington and Beijing never stays contained. Those ripples are already visible, far beyond Venezuela, far beyond China. In Latin America, governments are quietly reassessing their assumptions. For years, many believed they could balance Washington and Beijing, trade with China, security with the United States, and avoid choosing sides. That illusion is cracking. Maduro's removal sends a stark signal. The Western Hemisphere is not neutral ground, and influence there can still be contested abruptly. For China, the implications are global. Its investments stretch across Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, ports, power stations, telecom networks, all built on the same logic used in Venezuela. Economic presence creates political insulation. But now, a question hangs over every one of those projects. What happens when money meets force? Beijing is unlikely to respond with confrontation in Latin America. The costs are too high, the geography too unfavorable. Instead, it will do what it often does best: adapt quietly, minimize losses, protect assets, avoid escalation. Yet the signal has been sent. In a world of rising rivalry, influence without enforcement is fragile, and great powers are once again testing where the real red lines lie. That brings us to the hardest part of this story: the future. Not one outcome, but several. So let's look ahead, carefully, soberly, at what comes next. There are three plausible futures. The first is restraint. China absorbs the shock, tightens internal controls, and doubles down on deterrence rather than action. Economic recovery at home takes priority. Taiwan remains pressured but untouched. Power is projected through patience, not provocation. The second is normalization. Targeted military actions, raids, seizures, cyber operations become an accepted tool of statecraft. Not full wars, not invasions, but sharp interventions designed to shift facts quickly. In this world, crises become shorter and more frequent. The third is miscalculation, a moment where speed replaces strategy, where leaders mistake possibility for feasibility, where a bold move triggers a response no one can control. History tells us this is how systems break, not through intention, but through momentum. Which path we take will depend less on ideology than on capacity, on economic strength, on military readiness, on political cohesion, in Beijing, in Washington, and in Taipei. The most dangerous assumption any power can make is that others will remain predictable. They never do. And that leaves us with one final question. What should we take from all this? Let me leave you with this. What happened in Venezuela was not an accident, and it was not an anomaly. It was a glimpse of a world where speed has become power, and where restraint is no longer guaranteed. For decades, global stability rested on assumptions that borders were mostly fixed, that leaders were insulated, that force was a last resort. Those assumptions are eroding. The lesson here is not that China will invade Taiwan tomorrow. It won't. The lesson is more unsettling. that the tools once considered extreme are becoming thinkable. That action is increasingly valued over process, and that deterrence now depends not just on strength, but on credibility and readiness. If you care about geopolitics, about security, about how the world is changing beneath our feet, don't look only at wars. Look at precedents, because precedents shape imagination, and imagination shapes decisions. If this analysis helped you see the bigger picture, share it, subscribe, and stay with me. Because the next chapter of global power will not announce itself loudly. It will arrive quietly, suddenly, and without warning. And when it does, understanding may be the only advantage we have.